I'm Elaine Viets. Evelina Galang is a Filipina American who wrote a coming of age novel, Angel de Luna and the Fifth Glorious Mystery. Young Angel is a rebel who refuses to be grateful when she's suddenly sent to the rich life in Chicago from her poor home in the Philippines. In fact, she longs to get back to her beloved island. I'm very pleased to talk to Evelina Galang, who has been named one of the 100 most influential Filipinas in the United States on today's Dead End Job show. I'm Elaine Viets. Today we're talking to Evelina Galang, a leading Filipina American novelist and author of Angel de Luna and the Fifth Glorious Mystery. And you're listening to the Dead End Job show. Evelina, coming of age novels by Americans often strike me as books about the problems of people who have no problems. Their parents don't understand them, they can't get a date, they're not popular in school. But now we're seeing novels by brown people who are struggling to define themselves through their own words. Um, and it's really refreshing. What message do you want to get across to English speaking readers in your novel?
Well, I don't know if I'm so concerned with the message, but I think an experience is what I'm shooting for. In the novel, Angel is Tagalog speaking, but she also grows up in the Philippines learning English because that's the mode of education in the schools. So she's bilingual by nature, and actually trilingual because she also knows Ilocano from her father's side of the family. And one of the things I wanted to do in exploring language and using Tagalog in the text was to give the non-Tagalog speakers an experience, an inside view into a space and culture, an intimate perspective of what that life might be like.
Now, tell us briefly about your novel. Who is Angel?
Angel is a teenager, 14 years old when we begin, and she is part of this tight nuclear family, a mom, a dad, a younger sister, and her grandmother. And like many immigrants who come to the United States, before arriving here, there's this dream, there's this fantasy of what the American dream can provide for a family that doesn't have it all, or who is in a poverty kind of space, as Angel's family is. And just as the family is finally getting their finances together and they've got a plan to come to the United States, she loses her father. He dies in a car accident. He's a driver, and he drives foreigners around the islands, and he meets his death on the Cordillera Mountains. And so part of the setup of the story is all about that grief, that loss of that father, and then it's also about Angel and Angel and her mother. And her mother is also steeped in that sorrow of losing her beloved. And it's all about how the family comes together and comes to the United States. But it's really, ultimately, it is that story that you were talking about, that coming of age that you're talking about, where it's a mom and daughter not understanding one another, both meaning the best for one another, and yet constantly at each other.
Now, Angel's his story is very much about her relationship with her mother and her grandmother. They're kind of the heart of the book. And she very much misses her grandmother. She's embarrassed by her mother and her mother's healing abilities. What are those like? Is that really that kind of healing that our mother does, that laying on of hands, is that really done in the Philippines?
Actually, yeah, it is done in the Philippines, and it was something that I experienced when working with surviving comfort women of World War II. I had, back in 1998, brought several of my students, Filipina American students, with me to do research on the testimonies and the lives of surviving comfort women. And in our daily activities, if I brought a girl and she had a headache or she was having cramps or something, the women would just come, kind of quietly take her aside and put their hands on her. And I witnessed this on several occasions and thought it was interesting. And then when I came back here to the United States, I noticed or I learned about this thing called Reiki. Have you heard of it?
I've heard of it. I don't
Yeah,
know very much about it.
it's energy work, and it's a kind of healing. And so I thought it was interesting that there was this kind of healing with the hands that I'd witnessed, very much an integral part of the everyday life of these women that I worked with, and they didn't have a name for it. They didn't take a class for it. They just did it. They just would come to you and they'd put their hands on you and they'd take care of you. There's a whole culture of helots in the Philippines, especially from the provinces where it's faith healing and that kind of thing. And when I saw it here in the United States, I started to study it specifically because of the women, and so it became that aspect of Angel's mother and his mother, the healing hands, is an integral part of the story.
Now, your novel very movingly portrays the Filipina comfort women of World War II. Would you tell us about these women?
Yeah, so I'm not sure how much your readers know about the comfort women in general, but during World War II, there were over 200,000 women and girls all over Asia that were taken by the Japanese Imperial Army and put into these military slave camps all over it. Most of the women that people hear about are the Korean comfort women, but also in China, also in the Philippines and in Thailand and Malaysia, and even in Japan there were women that were taken. And the women I have been working with specifically are the Filipinas. In the Philippines, they estimate like 1,000 women were taken. And I've had the good fortune of meeting up with 40 of the women and really examining the lives of 15 of the women for the last 15 years.
Now, for many of these women, even though it wasn't their fault that they were repeatedly raped, sometimes for years, they often have a great sense of shame about what happened to them. Is that still true?
Yes, I think that in the beginning, the women were silent, not just the Filipino women, but women at large were silent for about 50 years. And the Filipina comfort women, in particular, when they finally started to come forward, telling their stories, making their injustices known, they were the first to actually file a complaint with the Japanese government on their own behalf. Right, so in Korea, many of the Korean officials and the community have risen up and have spoken for the Korean women, but in the Philippines, it was the women themselves who came forward. And you know what? I'm talking about this, and it means so much to me, and I think I've lost the question.
No, you answered it fine.
um, yeah. So, so their lives and their silence for many years kept them in this. It was part of this culture of shame and gossip, which is very much a part of the cultural experience of the of the Philippines, and oftentimes it's actually brought over here by the immigrants and kind of bestowed upon their children and families. So it's something that those of us who are Filipino American understand this notion of chismis and hiya. But when the comfort women, the Filipinas, started to come forward, first there was that, and then there was this understanding as they were fighting for justice and marching to the Japanese embassy and going to the courts in Japan. They started to realize that this was really something that happened to them, that they were victims, and that they had a right to an apology. They had a right to say this was not my fault, and they started to break those social norms or those feelings of shame and guilt through their protest and through their political activism. So I think that this became, for me, in working with them, a great life lesson as a woman, and something that I really wanted to incorporate in Angel's story. You know, she starts out as a young woman who's who's lost her father and then loses her mother, and then when her mother is gone, she is working for this a convent that's also working with the comfort women and the social justice of the comfort women. And so, in working with them, she starts to find her own voice and she starts to stand up for herself. So I feel like the women, these comfort women, have many stories to tell, but also lessons to bestow upon us.
Now, when did your family move to the USA, and why did they move?
Well, this is really interesting. My parents came separately, and they did not know each other. My father came back in the late 50s as a doctor to Milwaukee, and he was doing his residency in internal medicine. And my mother went to Marquette to study English, a master's student, and they met there. Putting together a culture show, a culture night for Marquette University, the first Filipino culture show ever. That's how they met, and that's when our family came here.
Now, you talk about growing up hearing two languages that your parents spoke. Is it Tagalog? Is that how you pronounce
Tagalog, yes, Tagalog.
and which is one of the Philippine languages to each other. And I liked your description. You said theirs was a secret spelled out in syllables, fast and rhythmic, where vowels lined up one right after the other, triple A's and double E's, rupturing the air like fireworks. That's such a beautiful description of a language. You didn't learn this language when you were growing up, correct?
Not formally, no. I learned it. I learned it by eavesdropping a lot and watching them. I learned it by being around the community and sort of watching the way the words came out of the adults and then the actions and the facial expressions. I learned. I think I talk a little bit about this in the book. I learned in context the language, and there came a point, and I was probably 11 years old already, that the adults around me would come and they'd talk to my parents and they'd say, "Oh, dalaga na si Evelina. Oh, Evelina's really growing up." And my mother would warn them, "She knows what you're talking about. You got to be careful. You're going to give her a big head."
My family is German American, and my parents spoke German, and my grandmother spoke German when they didn't want me to know what they were saying. And I was not allowed. I wanted to take it at school. And I was told, no, that's the language of the enemy. They were still hung up on World War II, and you are not going to learn to talk like that. Wow. And I've always regretted it because I think it would be a wonderful thing to learn another language, and Americans are not so good at that.
Right. Well, it's really funny because I say that I learned from watching them, right? But I also think about it. There was a time when my parents went back to the Philippines, and I think I must have been an infant. I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, home of 3 Mile Island, so I'm an American. But they brought me back
and radiated besides.
And I radiate, truly. And when they brought me back, I was still an infant, and everyone around me was speaking the language, right? And to me, my mom and dad would speak to me in English, but around in Tagalog. So I really think that in some ways, on an intuitive level, Tagalog probably was my first language in the sense that those were the words that surrounded me as I was learning to walk and learning to talk and learning to interact with people.
Now, Angel's father is a drummer, a musician, and she sees the world in terms of drumming and music. Are words your music, or are you also a musician?
I took piano lessons for many years, so I am a musician of sorts, but I have a great love of language, the way words sound, the way they create patterns when you put them, next to each other, the way the length of a sentence can make a difference in meaning and intonation next to a shorter sentence or a longer one or a one-word sentence. And I love the play of language. I'm not a poet, but I feel that a lot of the influences for me have come from reading poetry and listening to spoken word poetry and just loving words.
Now, you talked about the difficulty of juggling with what you call a hyphenated ethnicity, in your case, Filipina American. Mm-hmm. Were you made to feel different? In what was it that made it so difficult?
I think that everyone around me, and especially if there's anyone from my childhood listening, everyone has always been nice to me. But that's like to be nice. And mm-hmm. Everyone has always been welcoming to a point. And I think that growing up Filipina American in a neighborhood and in a school where we were the only, at the time that we were there, my brothers and I, and then my sisters and my other brothers came, we were the only Filipino American family in our neighborhood at our school. and now of course there are many, but at that time not so many. And people were nice, but I was always part of the culture, but I was never completely in the culture. I think, in school, right? And then at home you walk into the house and you were in the Philippines in many ways, right? The culture was very much the upbringing that my parents probably experienced growing up too, and a coming together of their own understanding of, because they too came from very different parts of the Philippines. So, but we were very much inculcated with the Filipino American culture within the home. So there was always this. It's like wearing two hats, like trying to be hip and cool at school, and then coming home and not being so hip and cool, I guess. And yet, there were many things that my friends and I did not participate in together because I just wasn't a part of that whole scene. I don't know how to describe it. So maybe for my brothers it was a little bit more visceral because they were getting in fights all the time, and funny things, like, I mean, not so funny, but kind of funny things, like a parent would come over and say, your son just karate chopped my kid, and he shouldn't be using his black belt. Well, none of us studied the martial arts, so like, come on, So I think just growing up, and there was sort of a tendency because I was liked, and there was a niceness to growing up in my community that I was never really pushed one way or the other. But I think that when I look back at things, and I look back at the kinds of relationships my friends had and kids have at school, and sort of, and actually when I look now at my nephews and nieces and kind of the global nature of the kids who are at school, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way people accept culture and that kind of thing, it's really amazing to me because it's a different world. There's an understanding that there's a world outside of Brookfield. There's an understanding that there's a nation outside of the United States, and that sometimes those kids are in school with you, and it's absolutely cool to have them there because now you're learning about different things and you can participate in different parts of culture, that kind of thing, which wasn't really a focus when I was growing up, I think, in the 1970s.
Well, can you read us a very short section from your book? Because the writing is so beautiful. And if your publisher hadn't tagged it young adult, I would have had no idea that this was a novel for teenagers because
Right.
I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was their tag. This book was written as a story, and the labels are arbitrary, I think, but so be it. I'll read to you chapter 23, which sounds long, but it's not.
Okay.
I am surrounded by Papang's drums, all of them stacked and spread about me like a silver cityscape. I light a cigarette and hang it from the corner of my mouth. I think of my mother and I want to explode. I see Lola Annie lying in the hospital bed and I want to hit someone. If only I truly was a Hilot. If only I could do it. I would. I would open my mouth and hot flames of wind would shoot out of me. No words. I puff on the cigarette and trails of smoke float to the rising half moon. Words, like little grains of uncooked rice, rattle in a tin can, tumble inside of me. Through the sticks, I tell myself, through the sticks. Let the words vibrate through the skins, I say, through the skins. Syllables escape. Words release themselves in hiccups, in beats, staccato, syncopated, long and short, quarter, half, 16th beats with spaces in between for silence. With silence. It is in the beat. Silence. It is in the knock, knock, knock at the center of my chest. I roll my sticks across the drums. I roll the skins. I roll the drums. I bang the drum. I bang the drum. My words fall out of me loud and clear in Tagalog, in Ilocano, and if you've forgotten the mother tongue, then hear the words in your precious English, Inay. I kick the bass drum. I kick the bass drum. Inay shows up even with my eyes closed, staring at me with those big brown eyes, smiling like she thinks my anger is funny. She says she loves me. I bang the tom-tom. Says everything she does is because she loves me. Boom, bang, pop. Where is she now? Lola Annie is dying. Where are you now? Bang, pop, bang. Anobayan, anyhow. I kick the bass drum. It booms louder than my heart. I pound on one drum with two sticks. Bang, bang, bang. I pound with two sticks on two drums. I kick the bass drum. I kick the bass drum. Now my eyes pop. Now my tears fall. I kick the bass drum. Bam, bam, bam. Maki baka. I hit the drums. Maki baka. I clash the cymbals. Huag matakot. Huag matakot. And for a second, I let the light from the sky in. I open my eyes, but only for a flash, and I see my mother standing right in front of me, weeping, watching, reaching out her hands to me, and I hold the sticks up like she's the biggest drum of all, like rolling sticks on her skin would somehow make her understand. But then I remember who I am, and I smash the cymbals instead. I pound the tom-tom. I kick the bass drum. I kick the bass drum. Thanks.
That was beautiful, and it gives a real sense of the rhythm that's in your writing, that you can feel it. She is indeed the daughter of a musician, and it's lovely.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Now, you also, Angel learns about Dr. Martin Luther King
Mm-hmm.
in his I Have a Dream speech, and then there's her mother, who has her own American dream. How do these two dreams contrast?
Martin Luther King's dream or Angel's dream? And her
Martin
mother.
Luther King's dream and her own mother's dream.
Yeah.
Her
Well,
mother's American dream.
yeah, her mother's American dream is, for I really think that her mother's dream is about escape. Is about escape from the poverty in the Philippines. Is about escape from the lack of opportunity. It is about um, providing her children with this this beautiful possibility, this beautiful life. It is a dream that is lacking in the reality of what our nation, the United States, has been through historically, and it is lacking the experience and the struggles, I think, that Martin Luther King is talking about in his I Have a Dream speech. I Have a Dream is not just about naming that dream, but it's calling the United States to the carpet. It's saying, he's saying this is what it's supposed to be, but America has written a bad check. Is what he says, right? It's
Right.
like he's saying this is what it's supposed to be, but this is not what it is. And I think that for Angel, that is very much how her experience of coming to the United States is unfolding for her. That of course, she's a teenager, so it's like much bigger than the reality, right? There's probably someplace in between. There's someplace for her here in the United States, but as far as she's concerned, her mother has gone to this other extreme, and when she hears the speech and when she sees the march, she's reminded of her own struggles back home, and she's reminded of the realities in the Philippines and her own desire to call the Philippine government on the carpet, the way Martin Luther King does that for the U.S. citizens here. So I think she really connects with him and his mission.
And we have less than a minute left, but I was also impressed by the fact that the Philippines are, in your novel, are very warm, very beautiful, very brightly colored. And then poor Angel winds up in Chicago.
Yep.
Cold, gray. Uh, I mean, it's cold for her in all senses of the word, not just the climate.
Right, right.
And that, I think, is she misses the heat, she misses the love that she had in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
So very quickly, tell us what your plans are next.
My plans are next in terms of books.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I'm finishing. I've just finished Lola's House: Women Living with War, and that's actually the research the stories and the research of the actual women of World War II, the Filipino comfort women of World War II, and it's not just their testimonies, but it's also the story of my own relationship with them as I followed them back to their sites of abduction, and they told their stories to me in different ways and manners, and it's really where the impetus for Angel's book came from.
Well, thank you, Evelina Galang, author of Angel de Luna and the Fifth Glorious Mystery. I'm Elaine Viets, and you're listening to the Dead End Job Show.